conversation. Thank you very much for sticking with us. We have a couple more hours to go. And we're going to be calling on our next panel in just a second. If I might just ask, I think we can probably go to that now. Ask Arrow, Peter, Jason, and Sahra to please turn on your cameras. We're a couple minutes behind schedule. Thank you for joining us. We'll get this next session started. Really grateful to have you here. Thank you very much for logging in. Arrow knows this, that 4 years ago at WIDA, we launched an initiative called Next Gen Trade to explore the direction trade was heading beyond a focus on some of the traditional issues that have consumed trade policy makers for decades. I'd say in the intervening 4 years, and especially in the past 12 months, we've become so much more digitally enabled and dependent than ever before that maybe it's no longer a next gen issue. It is a today issue. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. But before we turn to this panel, I want to continue my shout outs to those of you joining us today. And for our panel dealing with e-commerce issues, I'm going to focus on some people with E's in their names who are joining us today. So Everett Eisenstadt with GM, who is one of our sponsors today. Welcome, Everett. Jay Eisenstadt with Mars Incorporated. Angela Ellard with the House Ways and Means Committee, and Eric Trachtenberg with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to our panelists. Sahra English with Mastercard, Professor Peter Swire, Jason Oxman, the President and CEO of the Information Technology Industry Council, and my good friend Arrow Audero, Director of America's Public Policy at Amazon, and one of our generous sponsors for today's event. As I mentioned at the top, for the past 4 years, we've been looking at this intersection of technology and trade as a central feature of WIDA's programming. But like I said, Arrow pointed out to me that digital trade is no longer a next gen issue, it's a today issue. And it's a more critical issue for America and the world, as we have seen during the pandemic. And as more and more countries consider ways that they might tax or regulate the space, this is all very critical to us. So I look forward to this discussion and hearing from our panel on a way forward on these essential digital trade issues. Arrow?
Thanks so much, Ken, and thanks to all of you at WIDA for organizing such a great conference. And I just want to start off by thanking our terrific group of panelists who have taken time to join us today. Peter, Jason, and Sahra, thanks so much. As Ken mentioned, we will spend the next hour examining some of the global trends, both opportunities and challenges in digital trade. Digital tools, services, products, and all that they enable have been critical for all of us, especially over the last year, but even more. They are crucial drivers of the entire US economy, strengthening US jobs, competitiveness, and growth. American digital services exports are now worth $517 billion per year, generating a US digital trade surplus of $220 billion. This is shared by businesses both small and big across nearly every sector of the economy and in all 50 states. The surplus helps drive huge benefits for US workers, directly and indirectly, creating nearly 20 million American jobs. So that's probably why, Ken, I tell you this is no longer a next-gen issue. This is an issue for today. As the digital economy has become synonymous with the overall economy, it is more important than ever to eliminate barriers to digital trade. But unfortunately, we're seeing the rise of digital protectionism around the globe. The architects of these policies haven't been shy about their motivations either. Their goal of digital sovereignty relies on taking US know-how and handing it to their own companies so they can turn around and compete against the United States. Decision makers continue to advance a range of policy actions targeting US companies. Among them, as you mentioned, Ken, unilateral taxation policy, limits on transfers of commercial data and forced data localization, mandatory data sharing requirements that force US companies to turn over intellectual property, trade secrets, processes, and insights, and new authorities that give regulators outsized power over a small set of American firms. We will explore all these topics and more as we discuss the path forward on digital trade. I will give each panelist a few minutes to deliver opening remarks, and then we will jump into my questions. And as Ken has told me, we will open it up for audience Q&A at the end. But first, let me introduce you to our panel. Jason Oxman is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Information Technology Industry Council, the global trade association for the tech sector. Jason brings more than 20 years of experience as a globally recognized leader in technology advocacy and serves as the leading representative of the tech industry during a consequential time for the industry. Sahra English is Vice President of Global Public Policy at Mastercard. In this role, she is responsible for leading the company's global trade agenda and advocacy strategies for major trade negotiations and other investment treaties. Peter Swire is a leading privacy and cyber law scholar, government leader, and practitioner since the rise of the internet in the 1990s. He came to the Georgia Institute of Technology in 2013, where he is the Elizabeth and Tommy Holder Chair. Peter teaches in the Scheller College of Business, the College of Computing, and School of Public Policy. He is senior counsel with the law firm of Alston and Bird. Thanks so much to each of you. Let me first turn to Jason to give some brief opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Arrow. And it's terrific to be here with you and with Peter and Sahra to talk about these incredibly important issues timed with this terrific event to a transition in leadership here in the United States and the importance of digital trade conversations happening around the world. As Arrow mentioned, ITI is proud to represent 75 of the most innovative companies in the world, including Amazon and Mastercard. And we are active here in the US and in our office in Brussels and in Asia and in the Americas on promoting innovation-friendly policies. And this is a unique challenge and opportunity period for those innovation policies. It's an opportunity period, particularly for the United States and policymakers here, but of course, we all know that the US is a leader in global innovation and delivery of innovation technology to consumers and businesses. And we know that the US benefits greatly from digital trade and services. But we also know that in the midst of a global pandemic and economic collapse here in the US and around the world, the digital trade takes on renewed importance. We know the digital trade commitments foster global growth. 1 in 3 small and medium businesses relies on digital tools, and indeed reports in recent surveys they would not have survived the pandemic without access to digital tools. We know that 2/3 of small businesses tell us that technology helps overcome barriers during the pandemic. These are incredibly important times for us to focus on the movement of digital information. Indeed, the ability to move data underpins economic activity in all sectors of the economy. 75% of the value of cross-border data flows, for example, inures to companies outside of the technology sector. It's not just tech companies that care about these digital data flow issues. Over half of digitally enabled services that are imported into the United States from the EU, for example, are used to produce US goods for export. These are incredibly important economic issues. Now, we've been working with allies. The US has been working with our allies in the EU and around the world to pioneer the development of digital trade rules. But as Arrow alluded to in her opening remarks, there are some very unique and very disturbing trends in the world of digital trade. In recent years, we have seen a proliferation of damaging barriers to digital trade that state-of-the-art US trade provisions are designed to counter. We need to talk about them, foster them, and move them forward with the new administration. These new policies that ITI is very focused on working against include restrictions on the movement of data, unilateral digital service taxes, restrictive regulatory approaches to new technology. These global policy challenges are important, and they're important for the Biden-Harris administration to address as well. Now, as I'm sure we'll talk about over the course of the hour, there are good solutions that are out there to these challenges. The US has been in recent years and needs to continue to pursue international multilateral engagement as a means of fostering open and global digital trade and dialogue. Indeed, we've seen the Biden-Harris administration focus on prioritizing engagement with US allies and strategic partners. As the EU has moved forward its own digital sovereignty agenda. We have an opportunity, for example, to support the creation of a US-EU Trade and Technology Council that we think is incredibly important to enable structured, regular bilateral discussions between the US and the EU on digital trade matters. We need a rules-based multilateral trading system that enables US innovation. There are challenges facing the WTO, but we need to help address those challenges moving toward the WTO, not away from it as we have in recent years. We need to address legitimate issues about dispute settlement and fostering greater flexibility to negotiate trade rules. And the US can assert its leadership by helping advance solutions there so we can re-engage the WTO on e-commerce and other global trade solutions. Now, we also are looking for global solutions to tax issues as well, and I know we'll talk about that today. All in all, our digital trade agenda at ITI and our member companies is about reasserting US leadership and commitment to global institutions at the same time. It's about standing up together with our partners around the world and pursuing mechanisms for the acceptance of state-of-the-art digital trade mechanisms like we saw in the digital trade chapter of the USMCA. These are the kind of things we're looking forward to working on together with our industry, civil society, and government partners around the world. And we believe these new mechanisms can support the importance of digital trade.
Thank you so much, Jason. Let me turn next to Sahra.
Thank you, Arrow, and thank you to WIDA for hosting this panel. I'll just pick up on a few things that actually Jason highlighted and sort of lay out some ideas for sort of where we can go on digital trade. So, you know, trade and services, I feel like I talk about this all the time, but it's truly underrepresented and sort of sometimes undercounted as part of the US trade agenda. I mean, 78% of GDP, over 81% of unemployment. But if you even look further in terms of digital services like we're talking about today, you know, many small businesses over the course of the pandemic and what we're doing today have really relied on digital services and more so have had to become traditional SMEs have had to become digital companies overnight. So I think the value of digital services in particular are really understood now because of the pandemic. And, you know, even in our own business, we've seen double-digit growth in digital payments over the course of the pandemic as people turn more to digital and online payments. And I think digital services, the Internet of Things, is really where the US has its competitive advantage. And if you think about, and I like to use this example all the time, of connected cars, you know, more and more cars are becoming more computers and enabling services into those manufactured vehicles is really becoming the US competitive advantage if you look at it across the world. And so that's where we like to talk about the trade rules, and that's where the trade rules are actually the weakest. You know, USMCA really was the gold standard in digital trade, and not only around commitments around data flows and source code and IP, but also service market liberalization. Because as we all know, we are seeing more and more digital barriers put up against many of our companies around the world. And USMCA and those standards there are really what we'd like to see exported around the world. Now, turning to the new administration and sort of the Build Back Better agenda, I think digital services in particular have a real important role to play in terms of helping the industrial domestic base for manufacturing, but also for innovation. And here, I would like to see, you know, just as we're going to be seeing more strong labor environmental protections, I think we need to see protections around data, because data is really the value, is the currency of the digital economy today. And finally, I just want to talk about, in addition to trade rules and market liberalization, I think there is a sort of a need for standard setting, and especially in the digital space. Not only trade rules, I'm talking about technical barriers to trade, digital privacy, data standards, cybersecurity, AI. These are the type of things I hope the new administration is going to take a hard look at with our allies to sort of set the global stage, set the standards around the world for companies, for US companies and US small businesses. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sahra. And Peter, I'll turn to you last but not least.
Well, first of all, it was great to be here and welcome to everybody. I'm going to be drawing on my remarks today on largely on Senate Commerce testimony that I submitted in December And I've been focusing most of all on some of the EU and US data issues that have been so problematic. The US has had a long-term idea of the internet as a place that should be global, secure, open, and interoperable. And that vision of open and interoperable really is under threat in a lot of different directions. From the European side is coming under pressure because of what Europeans call data protection law, what the US calls privacy law. And this has been a sincere and substantial effort within Europe to have rights to privacy and to have legal rules. It goes back to the late 90s when Europe created its directive on these issues. And back then, the US negotiated something called Safe Harbor. I was in government at the time. And the negotiation was saying, if we promise to export the data but have Europe-style rules when it comes over to the United States, then the data can move. And that was stable for quite a long time. In 2015, in a case involving Mr. Schrems, the Court of Justice for the European Union, their Supreme Court, said that the protections when the data went to the US aren't good enough as a matter of their constitutional law, not as some trade matter or some political matter, but it didn't protect fundamental rights in their view because the US surveillance system has too much surveillance. Of course, many other countries in the world also do surveillance, but that was the challenge. The US negotiated a next version called Privacy Shield, but that got struck down last July in the Schrems 2 case. And that seemed very strict. It really put into play whether major companies would be able to transfer data between Europe and the rest of the world. Then it got stricter in November. In November, the regulators there, the European Data Protection Board, the regulators came up with their interpretation of Schrems that basically made any data unreadable if it's personal data if it left the European Union, except for a very small number of countries that the Europe considers adequate. Hundreds of comments were submitted to the regulators about this. This is in the middle of being fought out in Europe. But we right now face a situation where the only lawful way to transfer data out of Europe might be blocked and companies will be under great pressure to head towards data localization. Within Europe, there's a split personality on this. The Commission, European governments have welcomed the Biden administration, have held out a charm offensive on how these things should be resolved. But within the court community and the privacy community, the regulations remain very strict. And it's not clear how Europe will be able to get to a negotiated settlement that takes into case both its constitutional rules and these others. In terms of the Biden administration and some possible ways forward, we can talk more as we go through it. I'd point out that passing privacy legislation in the US has become newly important. President Biden supports that. We've had bipartisan progress in Senate Commerce Committee on that, partly to solve the Schrems kind of issues, partly because California has passed stricter privacy laws, so we want to have harmonized approaches in the US. But the thing that people who aren't part of data protection don't see is the rest of the world, other major trading partners of Europe have now all passed privacy legislation. Brazil put it into place this year. India is completing it. Even China has private sector regulation. And that's leaving the United States almost as a pariah, the one jurisdiction that doesn't have basic privacy laws in place. And so if we want to negotiate with Europe and the rest of the world for free data flows, the table stakes, the need to be able to do this increasingly is to have a plausible set of privacy rules in the United States. Organizations such as the Chamber of Commerce calls for mandatory privacy legislation in the last Congress. I think the business community has come around to the idea that having standards can be workable and are important to be able to facilitate global trade. But unless we get the privacy legislation passed, unless the United States has a good story on privacy, I think US services are going to face increasing difficulties, not just in Europe, but in many other countries around the world. Thanks, Sahra.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks all of you. Let me just start the discussion. A number of you raised concerns about certain challenges that are happening around the world. Peter, you just referenced what the EU is doing on what they call data protection, we call privacy, and other barriers were mentioned. How urgent are these challenges? I mean, how fast do we need to move to address them? And if we don't move fast, what do you think are the real implications for the US economy or other implications as well? Peter, you can jump in if you like.
Well, I think with the EU, and there's many other parts of the world, there's data issues with China and many other places. But for this data protection, the EU's been the leader. We could see court orders telling major US platforms that they're not allowed to transfer data out of Europe, that there's an injunction in place, or under their rules, the General Data Protection Regulation, you can see fines up to 4% of global revenue. So those are fines in the billions, many billions of dollars for major companies. And so there's a little bit of a game of chicken happening in Europe. How strict will Europe be? How much will US companies and the US government adjust in the face of this apparent strictness? But we could see real controversies, real court orders that would appear to disrupt things that people have been doing as a standard part of doing business. So in the coming months, we really could see that. And unless we start to see outlines for an agreement, the risks in that direction, I think, get bigger and bigger over time.
Sahra, how about you? What on other issues that we would consider under a sort of digital protectionism agenda? How urgent are they? What do you see to the impact to US workers and innovation?
So I'm going to pick up quickly on what Peter said around privacy and GDPR. You know, there's a real risk here to US companies and the United States in terms of standard setting around privacy. I mean, the GDPR is the global standard. As a company, Mastercard has adopted GDPR in every country we do business in. And here, there's a really risk of being left behind. So I agree 100% that I really do hope to see some legislation on a national privacy regime, because I think it gives us stake in the game in terms of negotiating with Europe and allies in general. And I also think it'll help unlock some of the trouble that we've seen at the WTO around e-commerce. Some other things that are challenges that we're seeing are, you know, the problems in digital trade are sometimes invisible or indirect, right? And so they come in the form of taxes or state-owned enterprises that get preferences. Those are the types of things that, you know, hurt our ability to have a level playing field in many countries. And the issue here is that the United States, especially companies like ours, where our infrastructure, our technology, our know-how are all based in the United States, we want to maintain that. We don't want to have to replicate what we do in the United States in all the 200 countries we do business.
And I would note, Arrow, if I could, Sahra and Peter both mentioned challenges around privacy regulations and also digital trade practices with the EU. I think if we need a great example of what happens if we let things fester for too long, India is a market that has shown us what can happen when digital trade policies move in the wrong direction. So just in the last couple of years, we've seen a number of policies that are really threatening to certainly US companies, but to global innovation and digital trade more broadly. Forced data localization is a policy that India has adopted alongside restrictions on cross-border data flows as part of their personal data protection bill and their draft national e-commerce policy. Huge restrictions on digital trade there. An expansive national digital services tax in India, which was very quickly proposed and just as quickly enacted. They're looking at tariffs on electronic transmissions, data services in India, tariffs on ICT products. They have localization requirements that fly in the face of global standard setting, to Sahra's earlier point about the importance of international standards for technology. India is adopting their own India-specific standards. All of these things have happened in recent years. All of these things are happening in a country of more than 1 billion people, which is enormously important to the US economy and to innovation generally. And it's a great example of what happens when we don't stay on top of our international obligations to ensure multilateral digital trade.
Yeah, sticking with you, Jason, so you guys have convinced us about the dangers of these barriers, but what is the answer? What's the solution? I know that there's certainly been a lot of calls for trading partners to come together, to work more closely on these issues, to find sort of, if not multilateral, regional solutions. How does the US government, the new Biden administration, sort of fit into that? And what should they really be pursuing? What would be a high value target for them at the beginning of their administration to deal with some of these issues?
And it is an important issue because obviously the Biden administration is relentlessly focused on economic recovery in the US. And at first blush, you may say, well, trade is not a part of that. But of course, trade is a vital part of it, as we've all been talking about all day thus far. four things that we've focused on in our recommendations to the Biden and Harris administration about how trade policy can really help advance U.S. innovation, but also economic recovery. One is reasserting the U.S. commitment to the WTO. I mentioned this earlier. The U.S. has been broadly over the last few years in the prior administration moving away from international trade bodies, making it difficult even for the WTO to appoint new leadership. The Biden-Harris administration has already moved very quickly in the opposite direction just in the first 2 weeks. There are encouraging signs that the WTO will indeed have new leadership in the short term. And we have suggested that the administration here in the US focus on re-engaging with the WTO, helping with very important reform that needs to take place, but re-engaging and reaffirming support for the WTO. That's one. Number two, the EU. It's our largest and most important trading partner. We don't have a trade agreement with them. The EU has pursued close relations, trade relations with China. That's obviously their prerogative to do so, but I think the EU and the US share an interest in advancing our own trade agenda. We think an important way to move that forward is to stand up an EU-US Trade and Technology Council. That's been a core component of our advocacy. Third, we really need to pursue mechanisms for expanding the acceptance of state-of-the-art digital trade commitments. You've heard mention of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement a couple of times. The digital trade chapter in that agreement was truly unique, truly different, and truly a model for the rest of the world. And we'd like to see it adopted elsewhere. And the fourth thing is we need new mechanisms and strategies to catalog these kind of emerging restrictions that we're talking about. We need to designate a senior official responsible for digital trade in the US government to make sure that we can take action early on when we see these kind of unilateral actions taken that threaten digital trade. So those are the four things that we've focused on in our advocacy with the administration.
Sahra or Peter, anything you want to add to that?
I'll just add two things on top of what Jason outlined. And one is, there's some talk about would the US re-engage on CPTPP. And I think Wendy Cutler and the Asia Society have actually outlined a way to get back in is actually through a sectoral agreement on digital trade. And I think there is a lot of, synergy there between some of our TPP partners, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, where you could see a path there to a regional or sectoral agreement on digital trade. So that's one, and that's one area that we're really interested in. And two is, again, going back to my initial comment around standard setting. Our company has been really trying to push toward whether it's the G7 or the G20, but some kind of formal FSB-like mechanism for data and technology. Can we get international cooperation around standards, around principles, around these digital issues like data, like cyber and AI? I think that's one area separate but tied to trade that really should be, we'd like to see the US, the new Biden administration take up.
Just briefly, one item is another early appointment was in the International Trade Administration, Christopher Hoff, to work on data issues at the political level. I think it was the day after the inauguration. So it's a sign of early awareness of the need to take action here. A second trade-related piece that people might not be as aware of is a new project at the OECD in Paris. So part of the battles are about what are the rules when governments ask companies for data, government access to corporate data. And the Schrems case in Europe is about that. The OECD, as part of its historic trade mission and data mission, has said that they're going to move rapidly in the next several months towards trying to work on principles for how rule of law democracies should be getting access to corporate data under the right legal protections, but doing it where it's appropriate. And that provides a chance for a multilateral forum where some of these discussions that have been hard with Europe turn out to be discussed in a more systematic way. So that's one hopeful place where we might see some project on how to work with Europe, but also with Japan, Korea, and other OECD members.
Thanks, guys. As I'm thinking about your answers, obviously a lot of what you said is really smart and good policy. I feel like they're solutions that may take a little bit of time. what do you think should be sort of the focus of the Biden administration in the more near term? I mean, I guess there's the question, should the Biden administration be looking at the same kind of unilateral tools that were used by the past administration? I mean, are there unilateral tools that make sense in this context as a lot of people are concerned about what might happen in the more near term? Jason, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, the unilateral tool preferred by the prior administration was trade policy by tariff, which is not a trade policy. A tariff is a remedy, and it's a remedy that's available under Section 301 that USTR has made liberal usage of in recent years. And I'm not here to debate whether those tariffs applied to various industries were or were not appropriate. But what I would say is that tariffs generally are used in the absence of a trade policy or a trade agreement. And so to your question, Arrow, the most important change that the Biden administration can make now is to engage our partners in trade agreements, because a trade policy by tariff does not work. It got the US involved in battles it didn't need to be in. There were two people in the prior administration who believed that, for example, that the Chinese government and Chinese citizens paid tariffs that the US government imposed. Unfortunately, one of those two people was the president, and the other was his trade advisor. I think moving forward, we need to move to a place where we engage in serious negotiations with our trade partners. Let's get those trade agreements on the books. Let's get those digital trade chapters in those agreements. And let's have a trade policy that, while certainly advancing the economic interests of America and US companies, also gets us back on the world stage, recognizing that 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States, and those are important markets for US companies to engage in.
So to follow on that, when the Biden administration may consider future FTAs, should they be looking to, what should they be looking at the digital trade chapter? I mean, I think it's widely recognized that USMCA was the gold standard, but the digital economy moves fast. Are there things that you think the Biden administration should be looked to include in future agreements? And then I'll just add to that for any of you, as putting aside Sahra's suggestion of, reviving the TPP, should we be looking at other partners, and how should they go about deciding who to engage with? Sahra, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I could go on. I mean, I could name TISA for those of you that remember TISA, but TISA was the Trade and Services Agreement that was basically put on ice since 2016. That was pretty close to final, covered 70% of world services trade. So I think that's another real opportunity that could be kind of looked at again. In terms of, other opportunities, I think, Australia and Singapore have done a really interesting agreement on digital trade, as has, Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand. I think there are these these agreements that are sort of trickling out of the Asia region that we should really kind of take a look at. But also, there are ongoing negotiations that the previous administration left: the U.S.-UK agreement, the U.S.-Kenya agreement, and the GSP renewal for India. I think, those are actual real near-term opportunities that could be looked at, and given the right environment and labor protections that we can add in there, maybe that's something that could be accomplished in the near term.
Yeah, and Arrow, to your specific question about what needs to be in these agreements, a lot of it is in the USMCA, but ITI has been very focused on some very specific areas that need to be in these bilateral, regional, and multilateral trading agreements. So we've talked about enabling the free flow of data across borders. That's got to be a part of any agreement. We've talked about prohibiting data localization. That has to be a part of it. facilitating the movement of low-value shipments, prohibiting the application of customs duties to cross-border electronic transmissions. That's a big feature that's got to be included in these agreements. Preventing discriminatory approaches to digital regulation. That's something we've seen in India, as I mentioned before. Also focusing on cybersecurity, focusing on privacy, as we've talked about. Market access. This is one of the big issues with China. China has a very strong policy of favoring homegrown competition at the expense of international competition. Let's make sure that we address market entry barriers in those trade agreements. Let's address sustainability and economic inclusion as part of these trade agreements. It's a great opportunity to put those issues at the fore. There are a lot of really, really important topics we can get in there, but those are some of the most prominent that we focused on.
Can I make an observation on that, which is, as some may know, the European Union position has been that data protection should not be treated as a trade issue. So there's really significant exceptions for data protection in a lot of the services, international instruments. And it reflects a view, if you ask the European people who work on data protection, that this is a fundamental rights issue around privacy, not primarily an economic and trade issue. Within the European Commission, there's the DG Trade that does trade issues and DG Justice does data protection. So there's a separation bureaucratically and philosophically in Europe between the data protection issues and the trade issues. Now, when it comes down to it, money's exchanging hands, services are flowing, data is flowing, they're interlinked. But there's been quite a strong bargaining position taken by Europe to try to separate data protection from that. It's interesting, as the OECD is working on this current effort around its trade and data, that those two streams are being brought together in a way that's a little bit interesting, that's going forward in Europe. And it's possible to maybe look at that as the beginning of a way to bring some of the conversations together that have been quite separate up until now.
Yeah. So turning to the WTO, Jason, thank you for your thoughtful remarks on the WTO. Obviously, a lot of us who are participating in this panel and a lot of other companies are really focused on the e-commerce digital trade discussions at the WTO as a really important step forward, not only for that organization, but honestly for global rules. And just having that discussion speaks exactly to what you were just saying, Peter, about trying to find a way to address the difference in views on something like data protection. Given the sort of historic challenges with reaching conclusion on deals, on these kinds of multilateral deals, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some strategies to pursue that at the WTO in the next 4 years during this administration. What should the Biden administration be focused on here, and how should they kind of go about making significant progress in such a critical area?
Well, I'll start, Arrow, if you'd like. I think there are 3 steps that we can focus on. One, as crazy as it sounds, is, and I alluded to this earlier, actually letting the WTO move forward and put a new director general in place. Leadership at the WTO is incredibly important, and I think the U.S. has made some important early steps in letting that happen. But we haven't had leadership at the WTO since the director general stepped down last year, and we need to move that forward. So that's step one. And I think it's important to embrace the fact that we do need reform of the WTO. And Arrow, you alluded to this. It's around procedural impasses. That's really where things get held up. And supporting reforms at the WTO. And when we reassert U.S. leadership in the WTO, we actually have the ability to support these kind of reforms and help them move forward. But the appeals process, as we know, has been broken. There's been a challenge in appointing the right people to oversee the appeals process. So the procedural reform is the second thing that's really, really important. And then the third thing I think is and it's connected to the first two. It's making sure that we understand the U.S. Our ongoing commitment to advancing commercially meaningful digital trade and trade facilitation rules through the active leadership of the WTO, through the e-commerce initiatives at the WTO. Once we are willing to establish that and assert U.S. leadership, and get leadership in place at the WTO, then we can move those reforms forward. And I think that's really important to the continued success of the WTO.
That's great. Well said. Sahra, or you want to jump in? I'm not putting you on the spot.
I completely agree with what Jason said. We sort of have to get back to basics and fix what needs to be fixed. That being said, I think it's sort of critical that the WTO really move more quickly on the e-commerce agenda. I mean, I was there in, I think, 2017 at the ministerial when they actually launched the negotiations after years of, us, the business community, kind of pushing for it. And, I have to say they have come a long way. And, I think Australia and Singapore and Japan have done a great job as co-conveners of the group to kind of push things forward. But I think this is the critical year to kind of really move things forward. And I am positive. I think that there will be an agreement. But again, it goes back to sort of the basics of the WTO, the structure, MFN, all that. So, but I do think that if they can't move on e-commerce, I mean, Godspeed.
I guess,
okay,
go ahead, Peter.
Well,
No,
it's a slightly different point, and I haven't followed recent developments at the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, but it's an example of another standard setting and internationally important economic sector where the US has not been inclined to participate as fervently as some other countries, including China sometimes, and this has been true in other standards processes. And the cost of that over time can be that the secretariat and the seemingly low-level actions can build up in a direction that's not really in the direction the US and global trade would be advantaged by. And so it takes patience to be at some of these international activities from companies and from the government side. But if you don't keep your eye on those different balls as they're happening, you can end up with an international system that's not nearly as advantageous. And so we probably need a lot more patience to participate in those places.
Yeah, that's a good point and well said. I'll just wrap up with one last question, which is, for me and for those of you like Sahra, I've been, participating in these WTO negotiations for years. It's always been so clear that engaging the developing world, the countries that really want to have strong leadership in e-commerce and use that, for economic growth, particularly in, pandemic recovery, are critical to success at the WTO and frankly, sort of around the world. What is the strategy that the US government or other governments should really be employing to bring them on board, get them to take on the right approach to regulation in this space now, rather than go down a different path that's been set out for them by some others who really want to follow digital protectionism? Jason, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think it's an opportunity for us to show a good model, and by re-engaging on the world stage, we can do that. Let's take Africa, for example. I think we have an opportunity with the upcoming African Continental Free Trade Area negotiation to participate in discussions to provide input, to support and provide capacity building assistance in the African Union as part of the efforts to put a digital trade chapter there. To your point, Arrow, and I'll be more blunt. China, as we know, is making very serious economic efforts in Africa, both directly and indirectly, to put their mark on the advent of trade in emerging markets. We need to be there too. We need to participate in the discussions. We need to show a better path to doing so. So I think it's an enormously important thing for us to do, because again, back to my India example, if we wait too long and we don't engage and we let countries move forward unilaterally, we end up with policies that disadvantage not only the US, but global economic growth. And that's what we don't want to have happen.
Peter or Sahra? You're good. There you are, Ken.
I am here, just waiting for Jason to wrap up. Thank you for the terrific conversation. I have a few questions that have come in from the audience. If there's others that want to submit any, please do. A couple questions kind of tie a couple themes together. One has to do with USMCA and some of the digital provisions that are in there. And I'm not sure who to direct this to. One has to do with the privacy. Is privacy an issue that's dealt with in any of those, the USMCA provisions? Is that something that still needs to be addressed? And are some of the provisions that the US updated in USMCA provisions that maybe could be applied for one way for the United States to partner with some of the CPTPP countries? Are those digital provisions ones that could create an opportunity for the United States? Maybe it doesn't fully join CPTPP, but it enters into agreements on different sectoral areas like on digital trade. Is that an opportunity for the US to work with some of those trading partners? Anyone want to take that one? Peter.
I could do a little bit on the privacy question. So Mexico has a GDPR style law in place. Canada has a relatively earlier law, but they're seriously considering a new privacy law at the Canadian national level this year that has a decent chance of passing, apparently. My understanding, and I haven't worked on it and others might know best, is that there was vague language in MCA about free flow of data, but not sort of regulatory attention to the differences in the three countries' structures. But it does show that even for the countries right next to the United States physically, that they have very different regimes when it comes to privacy and data protection. And if the US is seen as an outlier that doesn't protect things, there's risk going forward, even from allies as close physically as the two you're talking about.
And Ken, I'll take the second half of that, if you'd like.
Yes,
so I hate saying CPTPP because I always mess up the acronym. It would be nicer.
I worry about it every time I say it.
I know. It'd be nice if we could go back to TPP. Of course, as everybody knows,
many more ways than one, Jason.
Well, that's certainly true. So in 2018, I believe 11 countries signed the CPTPP, and of course, the U.S. was not one of them. And so the question is, do we miss out on our opportunity? About 2/3, I think, of the original TPP provisions made it into the CPTPP. So a lot of the good things that were in there that were agreed to during the negotiation process when it was originally signed back in 2016, but of course never entered into force because President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the agreement right after he was elected. I think there are, without going into details, I think there are a lot of really good things in there. My hope is those 11 countries would be willing to talk to the United States again, as they were back in 2016 when we originally signed the TPP. I think the open question is really the vehicle we use to get back there.
Great.
I'll just add quickly on both USMCA and CPTPP, at least on two things, on data localization and data flows. USMCA actually goes a step further and includes prohibitions for financial services. So financial services are actually included where they were not so in TPP, or they weren't holistically covered. So that's one area that would be really interesting to see. And then on payments, payments in TPP was the first time there were actual market access commitments on electronic payment services. But USMCA actually goes a step further. So I do think that there are some plus ups in USMCA, specifically on market access as well, that would probably be open for negotiation if the US were to go back to TPP.
Yeah, and I think, Ken, correct me if I'm, or anyone correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think the UK just applied maybe last week to join. So, maybe there's hope.
And we're going to have actually the UK ambassador on our next panel. Maybe Ara, I don't know if there's a question that John Weeks, who many of our audience know, was one of Canada's lead negotiators on the original NAFTA, and is on this broadcast. He asks, do we need TPA in place to be able to achieve some of the U.S. technology, the goals in the tech and digital space? Ara, is that maybe something you might have some thoughts on, or others?
Well, I would say that you TPA in place is critical to getting agreements finalized and implemented by the United States. So to the extent that, we're following Jason's sage advice that the best way to forward, our digital trade goals is through additional agreements, TPA is absolutely critical to that. But I would say there's a lot of other work we can do on these goals absent trade agreements. I mean, through a variety of things, like what Jason also mentioned, a tech and trade council with the EU and other kinds of work.
A really interesting question that came in about President Biden's Build Back Better call to action, and an interest in making sure that trade benefits are shared across sectors and groups in society that have been maybe left out of the conversation. This isn't specifically digital trade, but more, in an international sense, it's a domestic question and an international question. But what kind of policies can we adopt that take into account such groups like SMEs, women-owned businesses, minority groups around in the United States? And certainly, I think we got a little bit into it in the developing world as well. Sahra, I see you nodding your head. Is that something maybe you can jump in on?
Sure. Yeah. And, it's something that I made a point earlier about, and, small businesses are really critical to the US economy. And it's one way that digital services actually help facilitate better connectivity, better access, whether it's access to markets, access to finance. It's one area that our company is really focused on, specifically in the US. And if you think about a lot of these small businesses, many of them are minority and women owned. And we've seen through access to digital tools, their ability to export and grow actually grows exponentially. So I think more of a focus around helping small businesses, finding ways for them to export should be critical to the Biden administration's Build Back Better trade agenda.
Great.
Can I make one quick comment on
Please,
that?
absolutely.
So data localization is especially terrible for SMEs. Some of the biggest companies, if they have to, can put a data center in this region or that country. But if you're a small company based in the United States and you're small, you're not going to have a data center in another part of the world, and you won't be able to operate across borders. So data localization is a threat to innovation and small and medium enterprises.
I'm going to wrap up. We got to wrap up, but I don't want to leave one question hanging. And it's okay if someone doesn't want to answer, but had to do with Section 230 and protections in future trade agreements. It was included in USMCA, but it's become the subject of heavy debate in the US. Does anyone want to say anything on behalf of Section 230 in trade before we wrap this up? Or not? Jason,
I'll
please.
say, everyone's going to look at me, so I'll say it. And
I'm looking at you.
Stephen was kind enough to direct this question to me. Let me answer the question this way. There is an idea that the inclusion of Section 230 in a trade agreement somehow prevents Congress from examining. And by the way, today happens to be the 25th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, signed on February 8th. Of 1996 by President Clinton. That Telecommunications Act included Section 230, which we're talking about right now. So happy anniversary, Section 230. There's this idea out there that's been presented that the inclusion of Section 230 in a trade agreement somehow precludes Congress from having what is, I think, an important dialogue about the future of Section 230. And that's just simply not true. So I want to make sure to make that clear that any provision in a trade agreement that includes a law that exists at the time the trade agreement is signed doesn't prevent Congress from continuing to do its job and examine laws and update it or not if they choose to do so. And I think that's an important part of the discussion.
Well, thank you. We're going to wrap up now. Arrow, any final thoughts before we close?
No, I just want to thank you so much to Jason and Sahra and Peter for spending your time with us this afternoon. It was a really interesting discussion, and I appreciate it. And thank you to Ken.
Thank you, Arrow. Thank you, Jason, Sahra, Peter.